Hey guys, it is the time for me to talk to you about speech class, yes. And this is for session 5. Here's a couple of tips for both the speakers and the audience. Now here's the deal. Most of you will be asked at some point to talk about something that you care about, but this session is relevant to you. Everyone's going to be an audience member of an expert speaking at some point in your life. All right, so let's start with speakers. First and foremost, if you are an expert, okay, the first thing you need to be prepared for is know your content, okay? If you are saying you are an expert in Mustangs and how to change the oil in a Ford Mustang, okay? If that's what you say you are an expert in, know how to change the oil in a Ford Mustang. Know the terminology, know the language, know how to explain it, okay? You need to actually be prepared. So when you guys come to class on Wednesday for your presentation, and you need to be confident that you know your stuff, okay? That's the best way to prepare when giving an educational speech. You need to know what you're talking about, all right? The second tip I want to give you is anticipate questions from the audience. Remember, this session is you're acting like an expert, but the whole point of it is in speeches, how do you engage your audience? How do you connect with your audience and field questions? How do you get the audience engaged in something that you're an expert in? That's why we chose the expert topic, because you need to feel confident with what you're talking about, so confident that they could ask a follow-up question and you can probably answer that question, okay? So the way you prepare for that is you anticipate questions that people will ask. Now, if you've already written your speech or you already feel like you have a pretty good handle on what you're going to talk about, review your speech, review your notes, okay? Here's a tip. Set an alarm on your phone if you have one. If you don't have a phone, use your microwave, whatever. Set a timer for 4 minutes, okay? Once you set that timer for 4 minutes, I want you to write down every question you can come up with about your topic. Again, if you are saying oil changes, you're an expert in oil changes, start writing questions. In 4 minutes time, write every question you can think of about what someone might ask when it comes to oil changes. As an example, what is synthetic oil? Is synthetic oil better than regular oil, whatever regular oil is? Those two numbers, the 20-40, like, what are those numbers? What do those mean? Why does a car need oil? Why does a car need to change oil? This is what I'm saying. For 4 minutes, you write every question you can think of, okay? After you've done that, look at your list of questions and then go back to your speech and see if you can go ahead and head off some of those questions by answering them in the speech. Now, your speech may not talk about everything to do with oil change, right? It may be why a car should have the oil changed every 3,000 miles. If that's your topic, some of those questions, like a synthetic oil versus a traditional oil, may not be relevant. So don't worry about it. But if you have generated a bunch of questions, in your mind, you will already be anticipating the kind of question someone in the audience could ask you. So that is a great way to prepare for a speech. Prep by anticipating the kinds of questions people might ask. Okay, so that's the second point. So you've done your speech. 2 minutes, you've talked about changing oils on a Ford Mustang. And then you say, are there any questions? Or you open the floor to questions. Someone raises their hand, okay? And you've already thought, why, what's the difference between synthetic and traditional oil? That's a thought. You think someone might ask that question. Someone raises their hand, you say, yes, Bob. Bob raises his hand, starts to ask the question. Bob says, what's the difference between synthetic? At that point in your head, you're like, oh, he's asking the synthetic question, I'm ready. Be careful. It is very important as a speaker to listen attentively when a question is asked, because you might think Bob is about to ask you what's the difference between synthetic oil and traditional oil, but what he's really asking is, why does synthetic oil say you can change the oil every 5,000 miles instead of 3,000 miles? If you're not listening, you're going to go into a rant because you're nervous. You're going to start talking about, well, traditional oil is blah, 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 blah. Synthetic oil is blah, 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 blah. And you're not actually answering the question he's asking. Okay? So as a speaker, as an expert speaker, it is very important to listen actively when a question is being asked. Think about that, okay? If the question is ambiguous, and here's a tip, most people ask terrible questions, okay? It's not your fault. If you're not used to asking good questions, you may ask a bad question. That's fine, whatever. You may, as an expert, need to ask a clarifying question for the question they're asking you. So for example, Bob says, why does synthetic oil allow you to change the oil every 5,000 miles instead of 3,000 miles or whatever, right? You might say, oh, thank you, Bob. I really appreciate that question. Just to make sure I understand what you're asking. Are you asking what in synthetic oil allows that, or why do manufacturers recommend it? So like that's two different angles on that question. If you're an expert and you know the answer to both of those questions, asking that clarifying question helps make sure the audience is actually getting the most value so that they understand, oh, okay, so this is what I really want to know. Because they don't know what you're talking about. They're not experts in oil changes. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so when they ask questions, you're actively listening to their questions so that you're prepared to answer their actual question. You're also asking clarifying questions to make their questions even better, okay? Because they're not experts, you are. When you are answering those questions and you've clarified, it is very important to maintain eye contact with the person who's asked the question and stay positive. Now, sometimes, as an expert, you may know a lot about oil changes and the audience may not know. As an expert, you may feel like the question's foolish. Okay, you may say, what do you mean? Everybody knows that. Thing is, everybody doesn't know what about synthetic oil makes it where you can change your oil longer. People don't know that. That's something called the curse of knowledge. If you know a lot about a topic, you assume everybody knows this stuff. But that's just not true. You know it because you're an expert, okay? So stay positive when you're answering that question. Maintain eye contact and say, oh, thank you for your question. Or, oh, that's a great question. Thank you so much. Yes, synthetic oil allows you to blah, 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 and then answer the question, okay? So, but stay positive. Don't make people feel dumb when they ask you a question. Like, you might be able to get a laugh, but there's no reason to get laughs at other people's expense. Don't do that. It makes you look bad. It doesn't make you look like you're smarter. It doesn't make you look like a better expert. It makes you look like a jerk. Don't do that. All right. That's my tips for now on speakers and planning as preparing as an expert, okay? Now, as an audience member, again, every single one of us is going to be an audience when an expert is speaking. So this is relevant to all of us, okay? One of the things I have noticed over the years is that young people, teenagers like you, are hesitant to ask questions, maybe for two different reasons. But the big reason is because you don't want to look stupid, okay? Okay, you don't want to look dumb. You don't want to ask the dumb question. Okay, cool. Here's how you avoid looking dumb, okay? The first is pay attention, okay? When the person is speaking, pay attention to what they're talking about. If you know what the person's going to be, the expert's going to be speaking on before you sit down to listen to them, so in most cases in the real world, you're going to, say you're going to go to a museum and there's going to be a presentation on dinosaur fossils or something like that. You know that before you go into the room and sit down. So you already know what you're going to listen to. It's going to be something you're interested in, or you wouldn't sit down and listen to it. Now, during these speeches, the topic may be something you're not interested in. That's okay. You could, if you're not interested, you could easily zone out and start picking your nose, or zone out and start fidgeting with something on the table, like playing with her pen or something like that. And that will distract the speaker. It will also distract the other audience members. So do not do that. I'm asking you, as an audience member for these speeches, to focus, okay? You only have to do it for 1 hour for different speeches. Just focus. Now, when someone says, okay, the next speech, we're gonna have somebody speaking about how often to change your oil. One thing you can do to help you stay engaged is to immediately, just like I was talking about the speakers, the experts, anticipating questions, ask yourself a couple of questions about the topic. Oil changes immediately, or no, maybe you're going to see these archaeological presentation about dinosaur bones, okay? One question you immediately could ask is, I wonder what kind of dinosaurs we're going to see in this exhibit. I wonder what this speaker is going to say killed the dinosaurs, because a lot of doctors, people, scientists say different things killed them. How do we know what a dinosaur looks like? Because as far as we know, no one's ever actually seen one, right? These are questions immediately. Knowing you're going to be seeing a dinosaur presentation, these you can have in your head. And then when you're listening to the presentation, you can be listening to see if they answer your question, okay? This is a kind of a hack to keep you engaged in the topic. Ask yourself questions and then see if they answer the question. And if they don't answer the question and it's still relevant at the end of the presentation. So if you're like, how do we know what dinosaurs look like? And then the presentation turns out it's all about fossil imprints in sedimentary rock or something like that. It's all about the rock formation and that, and which has nothing to do with what dinosaurs looked like. At the end of the presentation, do not raise your hand and say, this is how you avoid asking like the stupid question. You don't raise your hand and ask a question that has nothing to do with the presentation, okay? But the expert might know. So if it touched on that topic, you could say, no, well, I really enjoyed, so you stay positive when you ask a question. You say, I really enjoyed the presentation. I really like the part where you were talking about XYZ. I did have a follow-up question on that. How do we know what dinosaurs look like, or the configuration of the bones, when we've never actually seen one? There you go. You've asked it respectfully, you've stayed positive, and then the expert has the opportunity to answer the question. Now here's another thing, tip for experts. If the expert says, yeah, that's a great question, but it's not really relevant to what we're talking about today, so maybe we can talk about it after the presentation. There's no reason to use up all these people's attention to talk about this thing that's very specific to what you want, but doesn't matter to everybody else, okay? So you have an opportunity to say, that's great, let's talk about that afterwards, all right? Okay, so as an audience, be respectful and pay attention, okay? Listen to the content. You should be able to ask a question after you've heard the content that you're curious about. Maybe they didn't answer one of the questions you immediately thought of, or maybe they said something that made you think of something else. Note it, be ready to ask it, okay? Stay positive. Don't interrupt the speaker. If the speaker takes a moment in his or her presentation to ask a question to the audience, this is not your turn to be the star of the show. It is not for you to stand up and say, well, thank you for asking that question. One time, I wanted to be a ballerina, when they're talking about dinosaur bones. Like, this is not your spotlight. Don't hog the attention because they asked the question and you now have the mic. Have paper out when the presentation starts. Have something to write with. Be prepared to take notes. You're not taking notes to judge the speaker, but things that you're curious about, ask questions, write those notes. Maybe that gets answered in their presentation, maybe not. Again, at the end of the presentation, if the question that you thought of is still relevant and you are curious and you want to know the answer, there's a good chance that other people want to know the same answer. So it's a good opportunity when they say, okay, anybody have any questions? I do not want to hear crickets. I don't want you guys just sitting there like, I don't have any questions. I don't even know what a question is. You better be ready to ask a question. One of the best ways to do that is to have notes, to jot down a little. Now, this doesn't mean write a dissertation. I'm not saying when they're speaking, you're then writing a paragraph. Just a little note. Write a little note. Be prepared to ask that question, okay? If it's still relevant. All right, so I do expect people to ask questions. So you need to be prepared, okay? All right, so there you go. This is going to be a fun one. I'm looking forward to what you guys present. Everyone needs to be prepared to do their presentation. I will call on some of you, but all of you will be audience members. So be prepared to pay attention, to ask good questions, and be respectful both directions. All right? All right, see you guys Wednesday.